If you want to flip furniture and are not sure what supplies you need, in this video I'll show you the things I use the most to help you get started. My name is Sarah, and I like to take things that are ugly and beat up or pulled out of the trash and make them beautiful again. Welcome to my channel. This video is a little different because I usually show flipping furniture, but this time I wanted to show what supplies I use to help people out who want to flip furniture themselves. So I'm kind of welcoming you into my workspace. Now I've broken this down into 3 categories. First, I'll show you the tools I use the most. Like, they're mostly simple, not very expensive, and I use them on most of my flips. The second category is going to be I often use, but not maybe every time. And then the third category will be they're nice to have, and maybe you don't have to have them if you're starting off, but something to think about getting in the future. So let's start with things I use the most. One of the first things you do in flipping a piece is you clean it. And I use one of 2 things. I have TSP that I use, and I just get a bucket of warm water, dump some TSP in it, put my gloves on, swirl it around, wash my piece down, and then I need to do a rinse wipe to get any leftover TSP off the piece of furniture. Another product I like to use is Simple Green. This I like for gooey, gunky pieces. Wipe it down the same as the TSP, and then do a rinse wipe as well. Now, once the piece is clean, I want to prepare the surface for painting, staining, whatever. And as much as possible, I'm going to use my orbital sander. When using my orbital sander, I want goggles, ear protection, and my mask. I do not want to breathe any of this in, get it in my eyes, or make myself go deaf. I use these on almost all my pieces. Now, as far as the sandpaper goes, I will use generally about a 120 grit sandpaper up to a 180 grit to a 220 grit. I try to have these 3 grits on hand at all times. I like to have lower, down to 80 or 60 or 100, and even higher. I think I have a 400 grit, but I've never used it yet. So I always have sandpaper on hand so I can jump between the grits that I need. Now for the face mask, I like this one that I got from Harbor Freight. It was not that expensive. I want to say it was around $40. And it has the filters for when sanding, but it also has filters for when you're like spray painting or using chemicals. And I want to keep both of those out of my body as much as possible. So you look like a space alien, but it's worth it to save your lungs. Also, your hands are very absorbent. Your skin absorbs. So I prefer to use gloves to keep these chemicals off my hands. I have found out using the 7mm gloves, I can reuse them time and time again until they rip or get to whatever. And that way I don't throw them away as much. The 5mm gloves are cheaper, but I tend to blow through them faster and I can't reuse them as well. So this is what I've decided to use for myself. Any piece I'm going to paint, I need a paintbrush, and a nice paintbrush makes a difference. I've used multiple quote-unquote nice paintbrushes that I've bought from cheap places, and none of them have lived up to this Purdy that I get from Lowe's. I always come back to this because it is very fine and is very nice and leaves a very nice paint trail. So this so far is my favorite paintbrush. I have not exhausted the paintbrush world, but this is what I go to. Lowe's is the closest hardware store to me, so that's where I get it from. If you paint, you need a paint can opener. Enough said there. Now, if you have something with drawers and hardware, you are going to need a screwdriver of some sorts. Flathead and a Phillips head are both needed because you never know what kind of screws are going to be on your pieces. So most people probably have this, easy to come by, but this is definitely I use very often. Another thing I use a lot is wood filler. There's a lot of options out there. I can't give an exhaustive recommendation on it. Wood filler is definitely something that I use very often, and I don't know that you can do a good flip without it because most pieces probably have dings and nicks that you need to fill. So wood filler is a must. Wood glue is another item I use on a lot of my projects. If something's loose, something's coming off, pieces are completely coming apart, you need wood glue. This one I use a lot, and I really like this Gorilla wood glue. It seems to be working really well for me, and as long as you keep the tip clean on your glue spout. I've not had any problems with it really drying out on me, so I really like this one. Clamps is the next thing that I use quite often. You might be able to get away without clamps if you have very minimal clamping needed and you can hold it down with painter's tape. However, I have 2 of these larger clamps and 3 smaller clamps, and this seems to be enough to get me by pretty well through most of my projects. So you could try without clamps, but this makes your life so much easier, especially if you have drawers that are coming apart. You can always find pieces that don't need a lot of repair, and you can just scuff, sand, and paint, and that'll cut down your supplies needed. But if you want to be able to tackle harder pieces, I recommend having clamps. Any piece that you have that you need to change out the hardware and drill a new hole, you're going to need some type of a measuring device and a power tool to drill the hole in. And then you'll need drill bits of different sizes to make sure you can make the hole the right width for your hardware. So most people have these, but this is something I use on a lot of my flips because most older flips have old hardware and it's usually at a weird distance, and to modernize it, you're probably going to need to put in some new holes. When I go to put on my top coat, there's a couple tools I need. One, if I use a clear wax top coat, I need this wax brush that I use to buff the wax on, and then I just need a rag to buff it off. And I like to pick a rag that's similar color to my paint choice, and this is nothing I work hard to have. I just grab a rag from my rag bin. Now, if I do staining, I want to use old socks, and I keep a collection of those from when my kids get rid of, their socks, they put holes in them or whatever. So I use those for staining or for wipe on poly. But if I do a brush on poly, I'll go back to my nice Purdy brush that I already showed you earlier. Now we're ready to move on to things I use often, but not necessarily all the time. While I will always use some type of cleaning agent to clean a piece, I won't necessarily always vacuum. But if something is very dusty, it's been sitting in my garage for a while, I really like to be able to sweep all the cobwebs out and nasties and stuff underneath with my shop vac. So this is not something I use most of the time, but I do use it quite often. Another thing that I use often is Bondo. Now, this stuff is vile and smells terrible, and you want to use that chemical face mask that I showed you earlier. But to use Bondo, you need some type of a putty spatula knifey thingy, and you mix your 2 parts together, and then you can patch holes. So this is fantastic if you have large craters of holes, big hardware holes to fill in, large spaces. Bondo is awesome. You need to build an edge or a corner. Bondo is fantastic. So for rough pieces that you kind of need to rebuild in some ways, this is my go-to for that. If I need to clean up hardware, I like to boil it in half vinegar, half water mixture on my stove. So I have a pot that I got from the thrift store that's specifically for this, and it stays with all my project stuff. I also have a wire brush that I like to use to scrub these or rusty bolts and things like that. So I use these often, but not most of the time. Another thing that I use often, I'm kind of trying to stay away from, is some type of a stripping agent. My default is citrus strip because it smells nice, but you need some type of a junk brush to brush the citrus strip on. And then I like to use Saran Wrap as well to keep it covered so that it doesn't dry out while I wait for it to do its work. And then some type of a rubber scrapey knife thing to scrape off all of that leftover. And any of this stuff, paper towels I use regularly, but that's just a bonus item. For the third and final category, this is things that are nice to have, but you don't necessarily have to have. And the first thing I want to show you is oxalic acid, and this is a wood bleach. I know people use household bleach, but I prefer to stick with something that's made for this. I don't know, I just feel safer about it. All I need is a solo cup and a junk chip brush, and I keep this chip brush with my oxalic acid, so I just reuse it over and over. And I like this, so I use it to whiten up my wood, mostly get stains out, water stains, things like that. So I use this, I probably use it fairly often, but it's not something you have to have good furniture flips. Another thing that could be nice to have is a paint sprayer. I've used one a couple times. I like painting by hand, but I think a paint sprayer can be faster. Cleaning it up is a lot of work, so I kind of steer clear from it for now. But that is something else that could be nice to have. One thing that I really like having is my jigsaw. Often pieces have these extra curves that I just want to streamline and straighten. And this makes it super easy and quick to just cut off these little extra things and sand it down so that I can make my pieces a little bit more modern. So the last tool, but definitely not least tool that I like having, but not must-haves, is this miter saw. I've used it on many projects, so it has come in handy. I have also used a hand saw at times, so you can get away with that at times. So this is just something that if you really want to get into furniture stuff, this and a table saw, because that's on my wish list, are nice things to have. So those are all the pieces that I use most of the time, use some of the time. It's nice to have, but you don't have to have. I will have a list of all of these in the description in this video. I hope you've enjoyed that, and I will catch you in my next video.